Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our series on the Battle of Hampton Roads, which was conducted in August of 1997. Our next speaker is one of the understated and most important Confederate historians in the country. His name is John Coski. John was the historian at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. Perhaps most noted for his study and a book on the history of the Confederate flag. However, at the time, that hadn't come out, or certainly wasn't the central purpose in my dealing with him. What he had done, being in Richmond with the access to the resources he had, is he had come out with a book published by Savis Woodbury called A Capital Navy. And the Capital Navy had to deal with the Confederates' defense of the James and York River, primarily the James River. And it was a fascinating book that tied in closely with the work that I had done on Magruder and the defense of the peninsula. And so it just made all kinds of sense for John to come down and talk about this at this point because of the implications of the master ships that the Confederacy were constructing. Their capital ships were going to be the CSS Virginia, which was the Merrimack coated with iron railroad railings, and then what they had learned after the first battle between Monitor and Merrimack, that Virginia was too heavy and too slow, and so the next ironclad that was being built in the Norfolk shipyard was the CSS Richmond, which was an all hands on deck 24 hours a day, 7 days a week tasking that totally consumed the Confederacy, from the president, Jefferson Davis, all the way down to the people hired to work around the clock at the Norfolk shipyard to try to get this thing done and afloat, to break up the Union control of Fort Monroe and the use of Fort Monroe in that area in Hampton and Newport News as a federal staging area and enclave for attacks against Richmond. So great deal of importance going on there, but the need for the support vessels to support these capital ships, the Virginia and the Richmond, the story of those is what the story of a capital navy is, and how this works and how it goes forward is the subject of what I asked John to talk to. I don't know where John is now. He stayed and was the historian at the Museum of the Confederacy all the way until the time that I think they dispersed their assets and so forth. And I don't know where he went to or what happened to him, or he might even be working at the new Consolidated Tredegar Museum. I just don't know. I haven't heard from him in a while. But anyway, really solid historian, outstanding research, and a very disciplined and easily understood and enjoyable manner of presentation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy John Coski as he talks about a capital navy, a clash of ironclads.
Confederacy was immeasurable. I would take as a pivot point the same comment I closed on yesterday, which was Jefferson Davis's letter to his wife afterwards saying that he regretted the loss of the shipyard and all the materials therein. That was the big concern he had at that point. Because from that point, we take on a different dimension. And this area down here and the things that are going to happen in this area is a different dimension to deal with. Our speaker this morning, our first speaker this morning, is going to describe for you the evolution and the practical aspects of that loss of this area and what it meant to the Confederacy, and in fact how the Confederacy operated from that point forward through the end of the war. John Coski is a resident of Richmond, but he's from these parts. He grew up with these parts. He lived in Virginia Beach, grew up down there. He is a graduate of the College of William and Mary with his doctorate there, and he is now effectively the chief historian for the Museum of the Confederacy, the only historian of the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. So John is extraordinarily well versed in all of this area. He has written a seminal work on which combined with Ed's work on River Lost Opportunities, 61, 62, and then John's book give you really the entire picture of this most valuable of waters in the state of Virginia and what it actually meant. So I'm sure that as you look through and you listen to this, you're going to find an entirely different dimension that will enlarge your thinking about what this entire operation down here meant. Please join me in welcoming John Coski. Sure. Sure. I do want these things. Okay. Good. And then I go, how do you do it? Okay. And then I go, I'll look for the dramatic. The better show is going to be in the back. Okay. Yeah. Fair warning. Okay. Thank you.
Having grown up in this area and now living down in Richmond, my first inclination is to say that it's a good thing the Confederacy lost Norfolk and kept Richmond. I like Richmond a whole lot better. I won't say that. And it reminded me again about Ed's book, River Lost Opportunities. I wrote Captain Levy in large part knowing that he had already done the best job that could be done on the war up to May of 1862. So if you don't get a chance to buy that book while you're in this area, please do so later, because it is, I do envision Captain Levy as something of a companion volume building on the River of Lost Opportunities, which does everything that can be done with the war on the James up until and through the Battle of Drury's Bluff. What I'm going to try to do this morning is ambitious in putting the Battle of Hampton Roads in something of a context, into several contexts actually, and naturally what I know the best is what I'm going to spend most time on, which is the defense of the James River subsequent to the destruction of Virginia and the Battle of Drury's Bluff. It's important, I think, because it tends to be completely forgotten because of the importance of what happened in the spring of 1862. So it's hopefully for most of you, except for Chuck Hunter, who's heard this in about 4 different forums by now, and could probably be up here giving the talk himself. It's probably something relatively new to you. And the way I propose to do this with slides is standing more or less in this neighborhood, not blocking anyone's view, but if I can avoid doing so, not use the microphone. If I were to talk in this level all the time, can you all hear reasonably well? Okay. By the way, I grew up in the Virginia Beach area. My father was Navy, but I had never done what we did yesterday. It was the first time I had been out in the water to that extent, and never a tour that went in all those places. I mean, that's 3 different tours that we took yesterday. And I'm glad I wasn't the only one who got into bed last night and found myself moving. Not that my wife was tossing and turning, but no. You're glad we waited for you. Yeah. According to my watch, I was on time. I take umbrage in that implication that I was late. See how far I can get away from the projector here. I'm not going to spend all that much time on the Battle of Hampton Roads itself. I'm sorry I missed the program yesterday morning and driving down. but I'm assuming you all are pretty well versed by now on the battles of March 8th and 9th. We tend to think of those battles in terms of the testing and proving of new technologies. This battle deservedly has a reputation for being this would be the first clash of the ironclads, for the proving of the superiority of iron over wood in naval technology. Really, nothing that was unexpected at the beginning of the American Civil War, but the culmination of developments of previous decades in Europe especially. But what we tend to forget is why this battle occurred where it did and between these ships. That it had a lot to do with strategic and tactical situations in the Hampton Roads and the James River in the spring of 1862. And more importantly, for my purposes today, is to remind us that these situations, the tactical and strategic situations in the defense of the James River, transcended the events of March of 1862. They were still important in 3 years to follow. My clicker is not working. It's going to be a long day, if that's the case.
Other way.
Yeah, why is it reversing? I had it backwards.
There you go, you got it.
Yeah, I had it backwards.
Oh, yeah. Hang on, we got you. This is what we get in. Like getting it.
Last time I gave a talk in Madison County last week, I used a machine from 1952 with slides that were 2 at a time. You flip them. Great experience.
There you go.
We're all familiar with the events of March 8th, the first of the 2-day battle, when the Virginia had one whole day of unchallenged superiority in Hampton Roads. What it proved that it could do against the wooden fleet, wooden blockading fleet. And that was, after all, the major purpose for the Virginia in its advent in March 8th and 9th, was to destroy, to lift the blockade. That was, after all, the acid test, the litmus test for the Virginia in the context of its time, to lift the blockade of the federal blockade of the southern coast. And it's a good thing you had plenty of map study yesterday, because I discovered this morning that my worst fear is my 2 map slides are very dark, not the room to my slides, for which I apologize. So good thing you already have in your mind a good vision of Hampton Roads. These slides aren't going to be of much use for you. But suffice it to say that the Virginia's goal in March of 62 was to destroy as much of the federal blockading squadron as it could and lift the blockade. Stephen Mallory, as you might already know, wanted in fact to send the Virginia up to New York City and bombard New York City. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? But Mallory had in mind an aggressive strategy using his ironclads, but was soon disabused by his own officers that could be done. So in effect, Mallory, even before March 8th, more or less accepted that the Virginia was going to be a river and harbor defense primarily, if not exclusively. March 8th proved that, in fact, the Merrimack, Virginia, could expect to lift the blockade almost single-handedly by destroying the Cumberland, Congress, and all but destroying, it seemed, the Minnesota, putting the Minnesota on the ropes late on the day of March 8th. So as of sundown on March 8th, it seemed perfectly reasonable to expect that Virginia would succeed in its primary goal of lifting the blockade with all the political and diplomatic ramifications that carried. Then, of course, in came the monitor on March 9th. And you get a lot of debate about this. I learned this the hard way in giving a program down in Portsmouth. Casey Jones' descendants were especially bitter. When I used as the litmus test in deciding who won the Battle of March 9th, the question of whether Virginia could succeed in finishing up the work of March 8th, that is, destroying Virginia, destroying the Minnesota, St. Lawrence, Rona, the other blockading ships in off Newport News and in Hampton Roads. The fact is that Monitor prevented that. The Battle of March 9th prevented, whether it be through the mistakes made by the Virginia crew or credit to the Monitor. The fact is, when the March 9th ended in a stalemate, the Virginia was unable to complete the work of March 8th. In effect, winning the battle is what I would argue. I'm sure even within this room I'd get some argument on that one. Another context explaining the importance of this Battle of Hampton Roads as not as an event in naval history, but simply as a piece of Civil War history, was the effect that the battle had on the Peninsula Campaign. George McClellan's land-based campaign up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond in the spring of 1862. What relevance did the naval events have on this campaign? McClellan later claimed that all along he had hoped to use the James River as his supply base, his line of operations, and that he was unable to do so because of the presence of the Virginia. And so later, when he changed his base, so to speak, his retreat from Richmond to Harrison's Landing on the James in July of 1862, he was saying that that's what he had intended all along to do, but had been prevented from doing because of the presence of the Virginia. And certainly the Virginia figures, the presence of the Virginia figures into the question of McClellan's march up the peninsula, why he established his base on the York River on the upper part of the screen rather than the James River on the lower part of the screen, and operated from White House on the Pamunkey River in the York River basin rather than in the James from the spring of 1862. What's also important to learn from this part of the campaign is the degree to which events on the sea, on the water, were determined by events on land. In my opinion, this is sort of one of the things that we learned from the study of this campaign and almost all the campaigns on the James River, is that what happened on land was almost always primary, and what happened in the water was almost always secondary, an effect of what was happening on land. Because what compelled the destruction of the Virginia on the morning of May 11, 1862, was not the Monitor, as you know. The Monitor had declined 2 opportunities for combat after March 9th, under orders to do so. It was the march of McClellan's army and the retreat of Magruder and Johnston's army toward Williamsburg and further that compelled the destruction of the Virginia when she was unable to lighten her armor, as we learned yesterday, lower than 18 feet and ascend the James River to Richmond. Consequence of what was happening on land, not as a result of any kind of naval engagement. But as I think I wrote in that summary of this talk for your notebooks, what this showed is that for the Confederates, stalemate on the water was not good enough. The stalemate that the Virginia faced after March 9th, or beginning of March 9th, more or less doomed her, that she had to win, not simply to avoid losing, because eventually events elsewhere, on land in this case, overtook her and effectively destroyed her. On the 8th or 9th of May, when it was clear that Norfolk was going to be evacuated, Admiral Lewis Goldenborough, about whom we heard yesterday, ordered John Rogers, commander, Goldenborough, of course, commanding the North Atlantic blockading squadron. Rogers, this picture, you recognize the motif from Miller's photographic history. John Rogers, commanding a division within Goldenborough's squadron, was ordered up the James River to shell Richmond into surrender. Every expectation that almost all the ships in Rogers' division of the squadron would be able to make it past all the bars, the 3 bars in the middle James, and literally shell Richmond into submission. That was the realistic expectation. Rogers was ordered to report back to Goldenborough when this was an accomplished fact. And as Ed was saying yesterday, in the spring of 1862, in the winter and the spring of 1862, the Confederates learned just how inadequate their river defenses were, learned from the effects, from the consequences of what was happening out west, and learned also as they looked at their own defenses on the James River and found how inadequate they are. Low-lying defenses as a rule. There were none on the north-south bank, or the north bank of the river until Jamestown Island and Mulberry Island. And there were none closer to Richmond than Mulberry Island, that is, at Fort Eustis today. The fortifications in Prince George County at Fort Powhatan had been disassembled in the late summer of 1861, the guns used down at Mulberry Island. There were no defenses in that vicinity, that close between Richmond and Fort Eustis, from the late summer of 1861. And already in the first couple of days of May, the Union fleet was ascending the river, including the Monitor, here shown with the subsequent commander, Lieutenant William Jeffers, who commanded the ship after Borden and Greene in the spring of '62, the much hated William Jeffers. The Monitor and a couple of other ships under Rogers' command started ascending the river and ascended quickly after the destruction of Virginia on the night of May 10th and 11th. The squadron also included this ship, the Galena. As you might already be aware, the Galena was one of 3 different ironclad vessel designs that were being tested by the Federal Navy. When the Monitor was commissioned, or the contract was let in October of 1861 by the Ironclad Board of the U.S. Navy, there were 2 other designs, the Galena and what became the New Ironsides, operating throughout the war primarily in Charleston Harbor. Rival designs. After all, they were all experimental at this point. Galena was especially experimental, a ship of conventional design with iron-clad, almost like clapboarding of a house. No special slope, no scientific effort to make the iron effective. Naval authorities in the North declared it beneath naval contempt. John Rogers was not particularly sure of how well it was going to hold up either, but he gamely made this ship his flagship on the ascent up the James River in May of 1862. He took with him, John Rogers took with him the Galena, the Monitor, shown here in this bird's eye view, behind the Galena, Port Royal, Aroostook, and the Naugatuck. The Naugatuck, otherwise known as the Stevens Battery, an earlier generation of naval experimentation. And what they were able to ascend past those points that Ed was telling us about yesterday, Days Point and Hardin's Bluff on the lower James, on the south side in Isle of Wight County, what's also known as Fort Boykin, Fort Eugene, Huger for the rest of us. And they engaged in some firefights with those forts, but like Fort Donaldson or Fort Henry especially, they found them inadequate, the Confederates did, so there was no problem for the Federal Navy passing by those points on the lower James. They found the Jamestown Island and the Mulberry Island posts abandoned, as they did Fort Powhatan, and there was nothing blocking their way to Richmond beyond that, except some fortifications were being hastily erected at Drury's Bluff, 8 miles southeast of Richmond. And what they found, as this bird's eye view shows you, were obstructions in the middle of the river and batteries erected on the south side of the river. It looked almost like the west side of the river, because the river runs almost north-south at that point. That had been under construction only since February of 1862. It was a relatively late decision, born of almost desperation, that the Confederate Navy decided to fortify Drury's Bluff in February of 1862. The obstructions shown here in a post-war photograph consisted of stone cribs to some degree, and later more stone cribs, but in the spring of '62, at the time of the Battle of Drury's Bluff, consisted of several vessels, including one of the few remaining vessels of the Confederates' James River Squadron, the CSS Jamestown, which had formerly been a passenger vessel in the New York, Norfolk, Richmond line, and a couple of other ships from commercial vessels from Richmond that were sunk at the obstructions sunk at the Drury's Bluff to narrow the channel. The obstructions remain one of the chief defenses, as it were, of the James River for the remainder of the war. The man charged with defending Drury's Bluff was Ebenezer Farrand, not very well known, Floridian, I think, by birth, Alabamian by adoption. A lot of you may know him for his work subsequently in Mobile. But Farrand arrived just days before the Battle of Drury's Bluff. He was in command of a force that was Marines, Army, and Navy. There's a lot of debate about the relative role of the Army and Navy in this, as many of you know. But Farrand was in overall command of the Drury's Bluff. He made a couple of decisions in those days in May on how to fight this battle. One was that he was not going to expose his own ships to battle. He kept his own ships, particularly those that remained after the destruction of Virginia. The strongest was the Patrick Henry, the former passenger vessel, subsequently a naval school ship. They were kept behind the obstruction just in case. The guns of the Patrick Henry were taken up the bluff. They were manned by naval personnel, including the Catesby Jones, as you no doubt learned yesterday, and the men of the Virginia, manned some of those guns, along with Augustus Drury's Southside Virginia artillery, within what later became known as Fort Darling. Army-Navy force, with the naval guns dragged up from the ships that were kept behind the obstructions. Naval personnel as well, acting as sharpshooters on the south side, Marines on the north side. There were two fortified points along the James, probably a good point to point these out now. Drury's Bluff, and then farther downstream, eastward, Chapin's Bluff, roughly a mile downstream. Those would become the two principal fortification points for the Confederates in the defense of the James from May of '62 to the remainder of the war. The battle, as you no doubt know, was a one-sided affair. The Galena did indeed prove herself beneath naval contempt. It was one of the worst slaughters aboard a U.S. naval vessel the entire war. The sides of the ship were perforated several times. It became a slaughterhouse of men. I think 11 or 13 men were killed outright on the Galena. Monitor was unable to elevate her guns high enough to reach the 90-foot cliffs of Drury's Bluff and retired. The rest of the ships took a beating with, I think the Port Royal had an engine explosion. For about 4 hours, the sides exchanged fire. The only real casualties sustained by the Confederates were late in the battle when a shell exploded right at one of the guns and killed a couple, I think 8 men. But all in all, a one-sided affair, one of the most decisive river battles of the war. This battle was the single most important battle in the defense of the James throughout the Civil War. And it established it gave Drury's Bluff a kind of reputation among U.S. naval officials that maybe only Vicksburg enjoyed. They more or less wrote off the possibility of ever sending the James River while the defenses at Drury's Bluff were still intact. One more dark spot. This is not a very good day for making slides, obviously. This is the deck of the Galena after the battle. You can imagine the damage. Subsequent to the Battle of May 15, 1862, the man you heard about yesterday, Charles Wilkes, famous explorer and curmudgeon, was put in charge of the James River flotilla that operated within the James River up to but not including Drury's Bluff. And this was the situation for the remainder of the summer of 1862 while McClellan's army was still operating at the gates of Richmond in its failed campaign to capture Richmond. There was the James River flotilla operating on the southern flank of the Union Army, only as far, of course, up as Drury's Bluff. And as a result of the land battles that were occurring during the so-called 7 Days campaign of June and July of 1862, McClellan's army retreated to the James River and established a supply base on the James, as McClellan had said he had intended to do all along. Harrison's landing there in the lower part of the screen became the supply base after all, and potentially a base from which McClellan could advance again against Richmond, as he said he wanted to do, maybe even doing what Grant subsequently did in 1864, crossing the James and approaching Richmond or Petersburg from the south. And McClellan, of course, failed to do this and simply retreated back down the James and down the peninsula in middle of August of 1862. And the James River, in effect, at this point, became a kind of, kind of no man's land, but it became a transition zone between the lines of North and South. Northern vessels effectively controlled the James up to about Harrison's Landing, but they rarely did patrol. It was more or less an unoccupied territory for the next year and a half or 2 years. One reason why McClellan waited, now this is one of the questions that I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of diverse opinions in this room, and I don't really have an answer for it, even though I've studied both the Harrison's Landing occupation and the Confederate Navy. Why did McClellan shift his base on May 11th, 1862? If that were his preferred base all the time, once the Virginia was destroyed, why did he not simply shift from the York River Pamunkey line to the James River line in the second week in May of 1862? One answer was that there was intelligence from Richmond that there was yet another rebel ironclad, another monster, the Merrimac II is what they called it in federal circles, that had been launched in Norfolk, that is, without its iron plating, just before the evacuation of Norfolk, towed upstream to Richmond for completion, that is nearing completion. All of that was correct, except the part about nearing completion. And by the middle of June or July, McClellan knew that, but probably too late for him to commit himself to moving his supply base. There was every reason to believe until about the middle of July that the Merrimac II, subsequently known as the Richmond, was nearing completion and would be just as dangerous, just as much of a threat to a federal supply line along the James River as was the original Virginia. So this is one of the leading candidates in answering that question of why McClellan failed to shift his supply base when he seemed to have had an opportunity in the spring of 1862. And Richmond will become pretty important to my story in the next few minutes. Meanwhile, back at Drury's Bluff, anybody recognize this guy?
Robert E. Lee's brother?
Yes, Robert E. Lee's brother. Very good. You think he's more handsome than Lee?
Supposed to have been.
Supposed to have been. Sidney Smith Lee, his older brother, otherwise known as Smith or Rose, was in command of the Drury's Bluff garrison for the remainder of the summer of 1862. His brother sent him a rather sharp warning to be nice to the Army guys, not to exacerbate an already existing friction among the Army, Navy, and Marine contingent of the garrison at Drury's Bluff. Smith Lee was also, in effect, commander of the rather small James River Squadron. James River Squadron's strongest ship at this point, Patrick Henry, this former passenger vessel, in a sense the first ironclad for the Confederacy because its wheel had been ironclad at Richmond in the summer of 1861, a special shield built for its side wheel. It had been the strongest ship in the James River Squadron with 10 guns. We did about 6 at the time of the Battle of Drury's Bluff. And as Ed mentioned yesterday as well, subsequently worked on once again, converted into the school ship for the Confederate States Naval Academy. But this was the strongest vessel, the old warhorse and workhorse of the James River Squadron. There were a few newer vessels. This is one of the only images, not the only image, of one of the 2 gunboats built in the Norfolk Tidewater area in the spring of 1862. While the Confederacy was committing itself to an ironclad building program, it was also entertaining Matthew Fontaine Maury's idea of building a series of 100 gunboats, little hornet's nests of gunboats that would collectively, by sheer weight of numbers, be able to take on stronger federal vessels. 2 guns per ship, 1 fore, 1 aft, roughly 100 feet long per ship. Easy to build. They could be built on tidal flats anywhere in Tidewater. Several of these were begun. 2 of them were completed and added to the James River Squadron. This one, the Nansemond, named after the river, was drawn here by Walter Raleigh Butt, who commanded it in the 1864-1865. And this shows, in fact, in the background, Drury's Bluff, the cabins at Drury's Bluff, which was the effective home of the James River Squadron for most of the war. So you did have a couple of specially built, Confederate-built ships as part of the James River Squadron. A couple of those ships taken from the powerful squadron down in the North Carolina Sound, the Raleigh and the Beaufort, that became part of the James River Squadron. But all in all, a very, very weak squadron to be defending the Confederate capital of Richmond. dark slide is not of Richmond, but of the Charleston Squadron. A couple of ironclads, Palmetto, State, and Chicora, in the Charleston Squadron, painted by Conrad Wise Chapman in 1863-64. In Charleston, as in Norfolk, as in Savannah, as in Mobile, and other places around the South, the Confederacy managed in 62, 63, 64 to build squadrons of ships specializing in a couple of ironclads, up to 4 ironclad warships per squadron. Pretty strong squadrons to defend the rivers and harbors of the Confederacy. Ironclad vessels modeled on the original design of the Virginia, but unlike the Virginia, not built on the hulls of original wooden warships. They learned a lot, as I'll go into in a few minutes, from the successes as well as the failures of the original Virginia. But what is most impressive to many people whose knowledge of the Confederate Navy ends with the Alabama or with Virginia and the Monitor is what the Confederacy was able to do within its own waters in the way of building home defense squadrons with a couple of ironclads per squadron. Strong ships to go along with a conglomeration of smaller ships, usually converted ships that made up these port and river defense squadrons. What I want to talk about for the remainder of the time is what the Confederacy was able to do in the defense of the James River in Richmond after May of 1862, and how they got ships like that, especially when the facilities, like Dry Dock Number 1, where the Merrimack was converted to the Virginia, when those facilities were no longer available, when there were no dry dock facilities available to the Confederacy after the spring of 1862. When the naval yards went to places like, this is in Charlotte, North Carolina. You probably heard about this yesterday with Casey Jones, who commanded here briefly. Some of the equipment from the Gosport Yard went down to Charlotte, North Carolina. Some of it went up to Richmond as well. What the Confederacy was able to do was create a system, an infrastructure, if you will, of naval building throughout the South in some very unlikely places. Places like Yazoo City, Mississippi, the flats up on the Roanoke River, at Edwards Ferry, where the Albemarle was built. Very, very unlikely places. Oven Bluffs, Alabama, where some of the most powerful ships were built on the Alabama River. But this was the nature of naval building in the South after the spring of 1862. Keep that slide up there because it's so riveting. The headquarters for all of this was in this building. Truck Hunter and a lot of other people, myself included, had never seen a picture of the War Department, the Navy Department, the Mechanics Hall in Richmond, what would be across the street from the Bell Tower on 9th Street in Richmond. This is the building that completed just before the war as the Mechanics Institute and became the headquarters for the Navy Department and the War Department. What was burned in the evacuation fire of April 1865. This is an image that appeared in the Richmond newspapers in 1896. This was the headquarters for it all. And of course, the mastermind for it all was Stephen Russell Mallory, Secretary of the Navy of the Confederacy, to whom must belong almost all of the, not the innovations themselves, but the willingness, the credit for the willingness to experiment with new technologies in order to keep the Confederacy competitive. And of course, Tredegar Iron Works, the single most important industrial establishment in the South, had a lot to do with all of this, not only for outfitting the squadron in Richmond, but all of the naval squadrons as well. Made it possible. For instance, it was Joseph Reed Anderson at Tredegar who came up with a system to bolt 2-inch layers of iron onto the ironclads when it was discovered through testing that the 1-inch layers put in this laminated form would not stand up to enemy fire. It had to put on 2 inches or not at all to be effective, yet prior to Anderson's experimentation, bolting through 2 inches was not possible. Little breakthroughs like that made the naval building program possible. But the industrial establishment of Richmond went far beyond Tredegar. What I refer to in the book is a naval industrial complex, mimicking our good friend Eisenhower, sprung up in the city of Richmond and elsewhere, looking here toward the Chaco Valley, toward the James River, that smokestack in the middle. It's about the location of 2 important industrial establishments that were taken over by the Confederate Navy on long-term lease that became the Confederate Naval Works and Confederate naval ordnance works that were assigned to the superintendency of some very fine officers. And this map shows some of the locations of these facilities, J and K being that industrial heartland down in Shockoe Bottom area. A lot of things here are offices as well. The D is where the Mechanics Institute is. But this was the center of naval activity in Richmond, and it was more substantial than we usually give them credit for. Richmond, of course, was a naval city. We tend to forget that as well. It had an established port. The port of Richmond was in Rockets, not where it is now down off of Bells Road, south side of Richmond. Shipping came all the way up to the dock at Richmond, again, with Shockoe Slip, Shockoe Bottom area, seagoing vessels, as well as transfer to the canal, James River Canal, reaching all the way toward Lynchburg and Buchanan in western Virginia. Richmond was a port city with an extremely active commerce on the eve of the war, a very wealthy city, in large part owing to this waterborne commerce. As I mentioned, the port was down here at Rockets. This is the famous photograph that's actually on site. You can see this from Libby Hill, where the Libby House, where the Soldiers and Sailors Monument is in Richmond. Looking down from where Luke and Libby lived down into the Rockets area, it looks more or less the same today. This area in the foreground is Rockets, the traditional port of Richmond, boat landing, and the area across also became a shipyard known as Yard Opposite Rockets. Real imaginative name. Named also for William Graves, a Norfolk shipbuilder who was in effect the acting constructor in charge of the yard on the south side. There were shipyards, fully operative shipyards established on both sides of the river. Rockets and the yard opposite Rockets given over entirely to the activities of the Confederate Navy from the spring of 62 to 65. There were already naval activities going on there beforehand. It was here at Rockets, for instance, that the shield was built for Patrick Henry in the summer of 1861. But it was transformed into a major naval center as a result of the fall of Norfolk. This became, in effect, Norfolk. Without the dry docks, this part of lower Richmond, on the east side of Richmond, became Norfolk for all intents and purposes. And what was done there can be counted as pretty impressive, really. If I can get to the next slide. I learned when I was in Portsmouth that you always give Porter first. You don't go to Brooke and then Porter. You go to Porter and then Brooke. They're rather sensitive down there about the relative roles of the two men who are most credited with not only with the Virginia but with the naval building program. John Luke Porter was the chief constructor of the Confederate Navy. He was one of the three men, along with Brooke and William Williamson, the chief engineer, who had something to do with the design of the CSS Virginia, the conversion of Merrimack to Virginia. He became, in fact, in 1963, in name, chief constructor of the Navy, and designed and drew the plans for most of the ships of the ironclad vessels built throughout the Confederacy, and certainly for the ones, a couple of the ones that we're talking about built in Richmond. His counterpart was John Mercer Brooke, who became the chief of the Naval Ordnance of the Bureau, the Department Office of Ordnance and Hydrography within the Naval Department in late 62. And he was the guru of Confederate naval ordnance. By all accounts, he was a genius, a temperamental genius, but a genius. And I don't have time to go into a lot of his accomplishments, but suffice it to say that after a rather bitter dispute with Porter about credit for the Virginia, Brooke shifted his energies to designing guns and projectiles. The Brooke gun, that double-banded Brooke gun that many of you are familiar with. You can see one at the Washington Navy Yard and another one at the headquarters of the Richmond National Battlefield Park on dry land. The Brooke gun was his primary contribution and one of the most successful naval guns of the war. He also came up with armor-piercing projectiles. It was Brooke that kept the Confederacy close in the naval arms race because of his guns and his projectiles. The Confederacy really didn't stand a chance when you think about it, but Brooke's expertise kept the Confederacy close. He was a protege of Matthew Fontaine Maury and was one of the two men that the U.S. Navy felt they could not afford to lose to the South, the other man being Catesby Jones. And of course, lost them both in 1861. I say a lot about Brooke, and in other talks I do. Let me go quickly over the ships that were built by men like Porter and Brooke and Graves, using the facilities that were available to the Confederacy in Richmond. I have 4 line drawings that were done for the book by David Meager of Alabama based on information available. There are no photographs, by the way, of any of the James River ironclads, no contemporaneous photographs. So these line drawings are the best we can do. And here you have a kind of a mini lesson as well in the evolution of ironclad design within the Confederacy. Notice that it's more or less Virginia, same kind of thing, the same roof-like structure on the platform to be submerged to the waterline this time. The design did not change, but once again, it was not built on the hull of another ship. It also was a shorter vessel. Notice, for one thing, the length. We're not talking 275 feet anymore, but more in the 200-foot length for all subsequent vessels. The draft, not nearly the 22, 23 feet that the Virginia was, although some edged up there. The thrust of naval building from the aft of the Virginia was as much as possible make the ships lighter without making them substantially weaker. And there are any number of ways of doing this. Virginia, the Richmond class, was the first post-Virginia class of Confederate ironclads. Not too much different. I'm not able to get this quickly. I need to take a step forward, obviously, to make it work. The Fredericksburg, built also designed by John Porter and built at rockets as well. Notice the draft substantially lighter. Notice the dual pilot houses, slightly shorter casemate or citadel, substantially lighter in large part because the spar deck, top deck, was originally not armored at all. They found out to the hard way in the summer of '64 that plunging fire could do a certain amount of damage to an unarmored spar deck. So they did eventually put 2 inches of iron on that, made it a little bit heavier as a result. It's still the lightest vessel in the James River Squadron. This was laid down in the spring of '62 and not finished completely until the spring of '64. The Richmond, by the way, to end the suspense from earlier, was not finished, fully launched the mission until November of 1862. This is the Virginia, too. This is William Graves' vessel built in the yard opposite Rockets. Notice again the citadel substantially shorter this time, but also that the iron was quite heavy. There were 4 in some places on the 4 1/2, 6 inches of iron on this ship. So a lot of iron, but because of the smaller citadel, less of it overall. Still, however, much heavier than the Fredericksburg. This was the tendency. Notice how the citadel, the casemate, was becoming more and more like the Monitor's turret. Finishing up with this ship, the Texas, never commissioned, considered one of the finest hulls built within the Confederacy. Once again, a John Porter design, built but not quite completed at the Rockets shipyard. What would have been one of the longest ships and heaviest ships in the new Confederate Navy. It had 6, and according to some accounts, up to 8 inches of iron in some places. So smaller citadel was compensated with heavier armor, in part because the U.S. Navy's technology was advancing at a much higher rate. The guns, especially of the U.S. Navy, were so good, and they learned the lesson in the Battle of 1865 that I'll tell you about in a few minutes, that the armor had to be heavier because the U.S. naval guns were so much better and could penetrate through iron, and the 12 inches of wood planking that underlaid the iron.
John, once you got that slide on the screen, can I ask you a question about the armament inside? I noticed there's 8 gun ports. Do they have 8 guns, or did they move 2 or 3 around to the gun ports?
Precisely. That was the consideration. I don't think there was ever reached a decision on how many guns to put in there, because of course the guns add additional weight. 6 guns is the most that I've ever seen designated for it. The 4 to 6 is because in some accounts they were intending only to put 4 and move them around, basically assign 2 gun ports per gun. But there's no way that this 17 feet would have been far too much for the James River, as they learned in 1865. And I'm not sure how much each gun added to the draft of the ship, but more than likely for this ship to have been viable, if finished as designed, 4 guns would have been more realistic, and even then it probably would not have been able to navigate the river very effectively. But in effect, it was learning something from the monitor as well, of additional gun ports available, learning something that is from the U.S. naval technology. This was home for the Confederate James River Squadron, and in the black mass in the foreground is Patrick Henry, and upriver is Richmond. This is John Ross Key's painting done in the fall of 1863, and in the foreground are the obstructions. So this is the defensive line of James River from the spring of 62 onward, consisting of river obstructions that could be opened and closed, they thought, at will to allow the passage of friendly vessels and prevent the passage of enemy vessels. Ironclads anchoring a new squadron of vessels all built in the south. Fortifications, Fort Darling, including an iron battery constructed. Special iron batteries built both on the north and south sides of Chapin's and breweries. The obstructions is a whole other story I don't have time to get into. But this was the arsenal of defenses for the James River at Chapin's and Brewery Club from 62 till the end of the war. And as I mentioned, the other vessels, Richmond and, Fredericksburg and Virginia too, not finished until just in the nick of time in the spring of 1864. The theater of war was a rather truncated one. We're talking about 9 miles worth of war. All these ships to defend 9 miles of river, and really from Brewery's Bluff up to Richmond. The important theater of operations for the defense of Richmond was from the confluence of the Appomattox and the James at City Point up to Richmond. But because of the obstructions, only the smallest of the Confederate vessels could make it down as far as City Point. And in fact, the ironclads never operated that far down. So this was the theater of war, and in a longer topic to go into all the problems created by the nature of the James River at that point. I suspect we're getting close on time. I have not told you about one other kind of defense in the James River, one that warrants a little attention because by some people's accounts, I think myself included, I'm still kind of undecided on this. I'm not a very decisive person. Torpedoes. Ed told you yesterday about the attempts to blow up Minnesota at Hampton Roads using torpedoes or mines tethered together by ropes and barrel arrangement. Not the most effective means of delivering torpedoes. This was not a new concept, and this was not a new delivery system. What was needed, obviously, to make these things effective was some delivery system that was more reliable, less arbitrary than floating things down. Confederates and Union Navy, the Union Navy experimented with torpedo technology, tanks, iron tanks, as well as wooden casks. Some of these things loaded with several hundred pounds of powder. But it was the delivery system that was still evading both sides. Enter Matthew Fontaine Maury. Matthew Fontaine Maury, who's probably the most famous naval person in the Confederacy, and on the eve of the war was the most famous naval personality in the world, many people would argue. Awarded and recognized for his work in mapping the oceans. He, through his services to the Confederacy, proved something of a pain in the backside for Stephen Mallory, who was an old political enemy of his, and devoted himself primarily to this task of finding an effective means of using torpedoes. And he's the one who experimented in his house on Clay Street, a block from the Executive Mansion in Richmond, with making little explosions in the children's wash tub, how to figure out how to make electric fuses work underwater. Long and the short of it is that he and a man who succeeded him, Hunter Davidson, a Navy lieutenant, former U.S. Naval Academy professor, had to mention that, who threw his way through the Confederacy as well. One of the men whom I tag in another talk, one of the foremost valuable men in the Confederate Navy. Hunter Davidson succeeded Maury as the head of what became known as the submarine battery service of the Confederate Navy and implemented the system of defenses on the James River. System of defenses that consisted of torpedoes in the water connected by wires to galvanic batteries on shore that were in turn connected by telegraph all the way up to Richmond, to the Secretary of the Navy's office. This was a kind of partisan warfare arm of the Confederate Navy. The men carried papers with them to identify them as legitimate parts of the Confederate Navy, so that they would be treated as prisoners of war if captured, not as spies or as partisans. And there were men stationed at each of these battery posts along the James River. These were all the way down the James to the area toward City Point, toward Hopewell, beyond the obstructions. And these were established first in June of 1862 and were considered one of the most effective means of defending the James, especially by Hunter Davidson, who succeeded Maury when Maury was sent basically in exile to Europe in the summer of 1862. He wrote to his friend Catesby Jones, then down in Charlotte, I think, or actually down in Chattahoochee, that he did not think that there were any Yankees who would be willing to come up the river to test his torpedo defenses. He was wrong. I mentioned that the river was a kind of no man's land from the spring of '62 onward. Federal ships were patrolling up the river, and one of those occasions was in the summer of 1863, and the Commodore Barney got too close to the Confederate naval defenses, and his ship was crippled. The Commodore Barney was crippled by the explosion of a torpedo. One of the few instances in history in which a ship was saved by a staff meeting. That apparently the only man who was manning the batteries that day on the James River was a relatively experienced man. The rest of the submarine battery service were up in Richmond for a staff meeting, and he crossed the wires prematurely, exploded the charge too early, leading to his ship being merely crippled instead of destroyed as it should have been by all rights. But the Commodore Barney learned his lesson, and so did the U.S. Navy, as we'll see. Mentioned also the other means of delivering torpedoes. I'll need to rush through this quickly. But one of the great innovations of the later part of the war, used most effectively by the U.S. Navy, William B. Cushing, destroying the Albemarle in North Carolina in October of '64, was the torpedo boat. The Confederacy designed one. It was the headquarters boat, essentially, for Hunter Davidson, called the Squib. The Squib class of torpedo boat, this long 16-foot spar, looking like a microphone used in Hollywood. But in fact, to put this down below water level at the exposed hull of ships, even ironclads, explode it against the hull, set it against time on a timer, back up, get out of the way, and explode. And Hunter Davidson himself tested this out against everyone's favorite target, Minnesota, in the end of April of 1864 at Hampton Roads, and managed to do some damage to that ship in 1864, and proved the usefulness of this torpedo boat, the Squib class of torpedo boat. 3 or 4 more of these were built for the James River Squadron. And of course, you know about the famous submarine, the Hunley, which succeeded in blowing up a U.S. ship that was Titanic in Charleston Harbor in February of 1864. Even before the Hunley, submarine experiments were going on throughout the South. And of course, the Hunley, in effect, was the third of the ships built by the men built in New Orleans and in Mobile, the third of its type. Even before those ships, however, there was a ship, a submarine built in Richmond. This has been debated for many years, but the evidence is pretty clear now that in the records of Tredegar, that there was built at Tredegar a prototype and then finally a full-size version of a submarine that operated like this drawing would have you believe, hand-powered. That it was tested in the James in October of '61, and supposedly, according to this Humphreys illustration, used against Minnesota in the November of 1861. There's a lot of conflicting evidence that leads me to believe that it wasn't really used against the Minnesota, that this was a mistaken impression. But the Federals were certainly aware that something like this was going on. One theory, a fellow who's trying to flesh out a theory, is that the submarine that many of you have seen down in New Orleans, outside the Cabildo, was in fact the James River submarine transported along with the shaft of Louisiana to New Orleans in the spring of '62 and then sunk there. But what happened to the James River submarine is not entirely clear, but it's pretty clear that it did exist. And all this came to fruition. All these different defenses of the James came to fruition in the spring of 1864 when Benjamin Butler brought his fleet up the James River. What stopped the fleet in its tracks was the destruction of the Commodore Jones by one of Hunter Davidson's torpedoes On 6th of May, 1864, got too close, careless, 69 men lost their lives when the ship went up in one piece and came down in several thousands. And in effect, to make a long story short, much to the dismay of Samuel P. Lee, commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, he was ordered to bottle himself in the James River, his squadron, in the same way that Beast Butler bottled himself along Bermuda 100. The Federal Navy put down obstructions in its front at Trent's Reach, a few miles short of where the obstructions were in the Confederate Navy. So for the spring of 1864 through the winter of 1865, that's where the two squadrons sat. The Federal Navy obviously scared of the Confederate Navy torpedoes, as well as unwilling to test the already tested defenses at Drewry's Bluff. This man, John Kirkwood Mitchell, commanding the James River Squadron, opposing the U.S. Navy. And there were a lot of combined operations. This gives you just a quick picture of the combined operations going on in the twisting, turning river between Drewry's Bluff and Trent's Reach for that 6-month time period. Robert E. Lee was getting a little upset at Mitchell and his Navy for being too defensive-minded, too concerned about preserving his own fleet rather than taking action against the enemy or preventing the enemy from crossing in the rear of the Army. This was, after all, it was most important to protect Richmond, not simply to protect the squadron. And Lee was rather perturbed with Mitchell. Finally, in the winter of 1865, John Mitchell had an opportunity with his James River Squadron, the one offensive that the James River Squadron undertook the entire war, to maybe do something to City Point, Grand Supply Base at City Point, analogous to what Earl Van Dorn was able to do to Grand Supply Base at Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. Destroy the supply base and cause Grant to retreat. The idea was to send the Confederate James River Squadron past a weakened U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy was at that point involved in the reduction of Fort Fisher outside Wilmington, so as weak as it ever would be, the water was high, there were reports that the obstructions were washed out, so it was simply a matter of getting past this labyrinth of land fortifications, past the various minefields and torpedo fields and remaining obstructions, getting past the few ships that were still there, the U.S. Navy, and getting down all the way to City Point and shelling the supply base and maybe destroying it, compelling Grant to surrender. A faint hope, but the only hope the James River Squadron ever had of taking offensive action. It turned out to be a disaster. They took a pummeling from the land forces, the Connecticut heavy artillery that manned the fortifications on the James River, the U.S. And most importantly, ships ran aground. Only the Fredericksburg, only the ship with that 9 or 10-foot draft was able to get past the various bars in the James River, even in high water, get past the federal obstructions, and make it to the appointed meeting place. In part, that was helped along by the fact that the U.S. naval commander failed to bring his fleet forward. He was as scared of the enemy as the enemy was of him. But nevertheless, the Confederates didn't even need to oppose, or the U.S. Navy didn't even need to oppose the Confederates to win the battle. Confederate ships, the two most powerful ironclads, Richmond and Virginia II, ran aground, fell under the fire, completely helpless, of land batteries for 12 hours. It was a disaster, mostly because of the inability of the ships to maneuver through the James River. The squadron could not even maneuver the river after which it was named. Then bring forward the Onondaga, the one remaining large warship the U.S. kept in the area. A double-turreted monitor with guns, 15-inch guns, firing 100-pound shot and shell. A couple of shots from the Onondaga penetrated not only through the iron of the Richmond and the Fredericksburg as they were retreating up the river on the morning of January 25th, 1865, but also cracked the wooden structure beneath. Gives you an idea of just how superior these U.S. naval guns were by the winter of 1865. Proving Grant's point that the ships that he left to defend the James in 65 were plenty. He was hoping that the James River Squadron would try to break out at this point. He was convinced that if they came past their own obstructions, that his Navy could destroy them. Pretty sure that he was correct. And to flesh out the story, in the spring of In the winter of 1865, this man, the most famous naval officer of the Confederacy, Raphael Semmes, ended up his glorious career in command of the crippled James River Squadron, succeeding Mitchell, who was removed in February of 1865. It was Semmes who had to give the order to destroy his own ships, all the ironclads at Drury's and Chapin's Bluff, on the morning of April 3rd, 1865, when the city of Richmond was evacuated. And of course, the city of Richmond evacuated. Raphael Semmes' men became members of the Confederate States Army at that point. Many of them surrendered at Appomattox or Sailor's Creek. Some of them surrendered later with Semmes at Greensboro, North Carolina. David Dixon Porter, commander of the Federal fleet, opposing Mitchell in the latter days of the war, the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, called the James River Squadron the most useless force the Confederacy ever put to sea. Ships could barely navigate the river. He was proved correct. He said that the guns at Drury's Bluff and the torpedoes in the James were more than adequate to defend the James River. And to pile this back together again, what happened in the James River was fairly typical of what was happening throughout the Confederacy. There were these ironclads built on the design of the original Virginia, but they didn't have a very successful career. The three most successful and most bloody were the Arkansas and the Mississippi River, which proved that the ship could take a mauling and still survive, but then had its engines fail and had to be destroyed by its own men. The Albemarle, which sank an enemy vessel in the Roanoke River, but then was destroyed by an enemy torpedo boat. The only Confederate ironclad destroyed in battle. And then the Tennessee, which was mauled and fought effectively in Mobile Bay in 1864, but had to be destroyed once again by its own men. Almost all of the Confederate naval ironclads had to be destroyed at the hands of their own men. This was the common end, it seemed, for Mr. Stephen Mallory's Navy. And the reason that happened in almost every case was not because the ships were beaten in battle by enemy naval vessels. It was because of the events that were transpiring on land. The reason the Savannah Squadron had to be destroyed, the Charleston Squadron, the Wilmington, North Carolina Squadron had to be destroyed, was not because they were beaten in battle, but because Sherman's army, in the case of the Savannah and Charleston, compelled the retreat of the armies on the shore, as what happened in Hampton in May of 1862, which is why I draw the conclusion from this, and some of you may differ, that part of the problem was the Confederate Navy had to win on the water in order to make a difference. It couldn't merely fight to a stalemate, because the stalemate would simply delay the day by which the superior Union armies were going to change the strategic situation and compel the destruction of the Navy. So it was a nice thing. It's an interesting point for history, and certainly a tribute to Confederate naval technology experimentation that they were able to build these fine ships. But in the long run, did it make much of a difference? I'll end there. Thanks very much. John, have time for questions? Yes, please. Good.
A question. I realize this is a bit off your subject of the James River, but could we talk a bit about the York River? It would seem that there'd be some opportunity there to do some damage to the ships. Was there any activity at all by the Confederate Navy in New York?
In the York River, question about Confederate naval activity in the York. Early in the war, there were ships, at the same time that the Confederacy was controlling batteries at Matthias Point, Sewell's Point, controlling the mouths of the river, there were ships on each of the rivers. I can't remember the name of the one that was assigned to the York. George Page was on the Rappahannock or the Potomac, but there were vessels assigned, relatively weak vessels, more along the lines of the Patrick Henry and Jamestown. Those were actually strong vessels, comparatively speaking. Converted passenger vessels, captured vessels by the Virginia State Navy that were patrolling those waters. That was the extent of it, except, and some of you, please feel free to add to this if I'm leaving something out, that it was on the York and its tributaries that these gunboats were to be built. That there were some of these Maury gunboats laid out on mudflats along the York River. So they were counting on being able to fortified to build ships in those rivers, among the 100 gunboats that Maury had in mind. And some of them had to be destroyed on stocks in the York, in the Pamunkey, even the Mattaponiah, I believe, all tributaries of the York. Does anybody remember the name of the ship? The ship that was, it may have been the George Page, but these were ships of the Virginia State Navy that had been basically commandeered, which was the common beginning of all the squadrons. The individual state navies commandeered commercial vessels and U.S. Navy ships that happened to be in the waters, and it was a ship of that stature that was patrolling the York, but only, I think, until the end of the 1861 calendar year.
But in reality, the two big supply depots, one would be Harrison's Landing, the other was the White House. The Confederate Navy did nothing to prevent those supply lines from being attacked.
No, the question, did the Confederate Navy do anything to keep the supply line from being established, basically?
And then utilized after they were
No, they did
established.
not. They did not. There were no ships of any, there was no York River Squadron. Of course, was there a Rappahannock River Squadron? Wouldn't it have been, same token, wouldn't it have been an opportunity to establish a Rappahannock River Squadron? The same military geography that determined so much about the war in Virginia, about the different avenues of approach toward the Virginia heartland, would have made it difficult. It would have made it necessary for the Confederacy to stretch its resources very thinly if it wanted to do an adequate job of preventing enemy approach up each of the navigable rivers in Virginia. You would have had to have one James, York, and Rappahannock.
And Savannah was the same thing. They kept their ships at Savannah. They never went down the river. They kept running.
All the different sounds that fed into Savannah was even more complex than Virginia.
The Confederate Navy discussed from its very inception building ironclads. John Porter had a design all the way back to the 1840s, which the Richmond was actually made of. Since that vessel was roughly one-half the volume of what the first Virginia happened to be, the Richmond could have been built a lot faster simply because it was much smaller. What's your idea when they first took Norfolk and they decided instead of trying to resurrect like Virginia, simply lay the keel for the Richmond first, concentrate on that, and use the sister ship, and take a lot less iron to armor it, and it could have gotten out faster.
The question is whether it would have been better for the Confederacy to have done what it did with building the Richmond from scratch, that it would have resulted in a smaller ship using less iron, that would have been more navigable, rather than to have built, as it did, Confederacy did, a ship on the hull of a larger vessel with all the problems that entailed. Was that viable and better strategy? In retrospect, it probably was. I don't know if it could have been done faster, however. I'm trying to think of how long it took to convert the Virginia. That was the fastest building job of any ship that I know of. I think in the Confederate Navy, I mean, consider how long it took. The Richmond was finished in November, which is pretty quick, but because of iron shortages, primarily, I mean, the framing out of the ships was done relatively quickly, but the other ships usually took upwards of 2 years to finish.
The cost was a factor also, because when they were going to bring the Virginia, the Merrimack up, they decided whether they should remake it as another frigate or go an ironclad. It was much cheaper to turn it an ironclad.
Much cheaper to turn Virginia to Merrimack into an ironclad than to re-outfit it as an ironclad frigate or a regular frigate. But they certainly, it consumed so much iron and was so unwieldy that that raised, and certainly that taught Confederacy a lesson. And I don't think they could have done so as quickly, and for that matter, with as much confidence. A question came up yesterday about was there any completely iron ship within either Navy during the war, and I'm not aware of one except for the submarines. That is, the assumption was always that it had to have a wooden framing, I mean, 12 inches or so of oak framing in order to make these ships viable. I'm not sure that there's a confidence level among even people like Porter to build things entirely out of iron, or for that matter, to start from scratch, framing out a whole new ship. It was so much easier to begin on a hull because of the familiarity factor of nothing else. But that is, on my part, I'll caution, that's idle speculation. I don't know.
Take one more question.
Yes.
During Longstreet's Suffolk campaign, he had requested that the fleet assist him in the capture of Suffolk, and of course they refused. What's your opinion on what would have happened if they actually went down?
Did everybody hear the question? But the Suffolk, what happened during the Suffolk campaign was addresses the issue of the obstructions. At that point, the obstructions at Murray's Bluff did not permit the larger ships, at that point, the Richmond, what it amounted to get out of the river and get beyond City Point. It would have had to, of course, go around City Point. But in order to do it much good, it would have had to go substantially downriver and then get into the Nansemond River area to do any good. So it would have had to perhaps come into conflict with the U.S. Navy, which controlled the river south or east of Drury Bluff at that point. The sticking point was not the Navy, it seemed, but the Army. The Army engineers controlled the obstructions at Drury's Bluff. The Army engineers believed that only the obstructions protected the Navy from itself. That the Navy was so bad, that those ships were so bad, that the engines were going to fail. If you let those ships out, they were just going to destroy themselves. And in effect, Walter Stevens, and especially Walter Stevens and Jeremy Gilmer and a few others among the Army engineers, in correspondence that was published in the official records, and Mallory knew nothing about, were telling Seddon, don't, just forget about it. Just ignore him and hope that he forgets about it, in that sense. Because they were so convinced, based on the recent track record of Confederate naval vessels, that they were just going to go down and their engines were going to fail and they were going to fall into enemy hands and be turned into really good ships by the other guys. And there was good reason for believing that. So unbeknownst to Mallory, as he was trying to get the Army engineers to allow him to get the ships down there, the engineers were dragging their heels. So in effect, the Army was working against itself. But Mallory was sort of two minds as well. Every time he was always arguing that the obstruction should be opened up, but he was also fearing that he also wanted to make darn sure as possible to put them back. So even among Navy people, I caught quotes from John Taylor Wood to his wife and a few others, Robert Garlick Keene of the War Department. It was more or less unanimous behind closed doors, Army and Navy alike, that the ship wasn't capable of doing anything. So respecting their opinions, their inside opinions of the matter, I have to answer your question by saying it would have been a disaster. They probably would have gone down there and gotten destroyed by enemy guns, or simply have gotten stranded themselves and not been able to do anything. The Richmond especially had bad engines, as they all did. So it probably would have resulted in the loss of the ship and yet another embarrassment for the Confederate Navy. So that's my trusting the judgment of the men who were in the position to know better.
Much to my embarrassment, I found that when I made out that sheet of things, I forgot to put John's book on there. We do have it, and for those of you who asked me about the price, that is $33. That includes tax. So if you just want to handwrite that into the thing and do so, I